Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be here today. It's really an honor to have the opportunity to preach and be with you. I don't know about you, but I often find myself wondering what the heck is happening in our nation, in our world. Sometimes I just want to turn off my TV and radio, burn the newspapers, shut down my internet connection, and move to an idyllic place where there's no pain or suffering, no war or climate destruction, no poverty, and no active conflict among those living there. But it's not long before I realized that I'm too tied into this world, warts and all, and that I don't really wish to be disconnected from reality. I've been a news junkie for as long as I can remember. And so there's that. On top of that, living in a bubble where all is beautiful and perfect would be isolating and confining and would make it impossible to understand the situations of my neighbors who don't have the resources to remove themselves from terrible circumstances that are beyond their control. It would be easy to descend into hopelessness when so many things feel wrong. But if you're feeling that way, don't despair. I think our texts today give us great reason to hang on to hope and to do everything we can to give life to that hope. Things were not going well for the communities Isaiah and Jesus addressed, and I imagine they were feeling not just fear, but hopelessness as well. The times were turbulent, and their audiences faced threats as exiles or because of persecution for their beliefs. The people were anxious for their safety and unsettled because their futures were unclear. Luke presents a Jesus who understands his community's fearfulness. This community understood that keeping their heads down would be the best way to stay on the right side of the Romans. But we also know that Luke was writing a number of years after Jesus' death, and in fact, about 15 years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So Jews and early Christians alike remained fearful of the Romans. Many Christians over the years have suggested that Luke was suggesting a coming apocalypse. But this seems unlikely at a time when I believe Luke would have wanted to provide some reassurance rather than add to the fear. Luke knew that times were tough for the followers of Jesus and that their lives would probably become even more difficult before things got better. The fall of the temple would have reconstituted memories of the earlier temple destruction and exile to Babylon. Luke also understood that the community might be susceptible to following false prophets who might be preaching an easier or more promising gospel than Jesus offered. It's not hard to imagine the temptation to grab onto that hope. As I've read and reread this text, I tend to agree with a lot of the biblical scholars who believe that Luke's message to his community against these false prophets who would lead them astray in a time of upheaval and uncertainty. And as we live in our own time of upheaval and uncertainty, we also find a wide array of false prophets seeking to preach a much easier gospel than what we are called to as Christians. Just since the turn of the century, we've witnessed the destruction of iconic buildings at the foot of Manhattan, the changing face of communities because of immigration, a worldwide pandemic, storms, wildfires, loss of habitats and extinctions, and just the ups and downs of an economy that can feel like riding a roller coaster. Most of these events are the result of a convergence of factors without one identifiable source. But as we've often seen, it's easier to blame scapegoats for misfortunes we can see but don't understand, rather than accept that these events cannot be explained or result from factors beyond our control. Unfortunately, there are more than enough messengers who are willing to falsely accuse innocent people and groups for any misfortune that befalls us, absolving us of accepting our mutual complicity for events that we cannot easily explain. Whatever side you're on politically, I suspect many of you, like me, may still be feeling somewhat unsettled after last Tuesday's contentious election, wondering just how your lives may be affected when the new crop of elected officials takes over in January. Many aspiring to fill public offices, some of whom have been elected, have sought to place blame on the other for problems we face. Recent focus has fallen on anti-Semitic tropes blaming Jews, but we've also seen racism where fingers are pointed at Black Lives Matter, xenophobia that blames immigrants for crime and taking our jobs, homophobia that claims accepting our LGBTQ neighbors will result in the breakdown of society, and sexism aimed at women seeking to hold on to rights that have long been taken for granted. I believe Luke was trying to help his audience understand that in the wake of the temple's destruction, it's not ephemeral human accomplishments that matter, but how we view and treat our fellow human beings and how we function in community. Luke knew that his community faced persecution, but he describes Jesus telling them that instead of blaming others to deflect from themselves, they should look on persecution and prosecution for their beliefs as an opportunity to testify. Things would not change or get better overnight. The race this young Christian community was running was a marathon rather than a sprint. Luke's audience couldn't know exactly what to expect, but his gospel seeks to remind them that God holds the future and God would be faithful to the people no matter what. Isaiah delivered a somewhat similar message to a community in exile approximately 600 years earlier. It isn't difficult to imagine a demoralized people questioning God's faithfulness after they witnessed the destruction of their temple and their removal to Babylon. It was a community that, as the psalmist wrote, questioned how they could sing the Lord's song in a strange land. Isaiah's community was badly in need of a message that offered hope for their future, and Isaiah knew that he needed to deliver. While he knew that he needed for his audience to understand that it was their own actions that led to the situation they found themselves in, he also recognized that continuing to pound on that theme alone wouldn't offer the hope that was so sorely needed. Instead, he reminded them of God's faithfulness. God wasn't done with them. God was not about the death and destruction they experienced, despite what they saw as evidence to the contrary. Instead, Isaiah told them, God was about transformation, metamorphosis, creating beauty even from the most dismal of circumstances. God was about to create a new heavens and a new earth, and they weren't to remember the formal things. I do, however, have a different take on that particular statement, not remembering the former things. Isaiah is delivering the message that God would be creating a new Jerusalem, and it would be a joy to God's people. In that Jerusalem, there would be no more weeping, sadness, or distress. Infants would live beyond infancy at a time when many did not survive. Those who survived childhood would live a full lifetime. They would build and plant. They would flourish, and they would live in peace. The wolf would feed with the lamb. It's the very picture of a society built on justice. And while we believe that justice is what God ultimately wants and seeks from us, it won't happen and won't be sustained without effort on the part of God's people to do the challenging work that is required. In order to know what needs to be done, it's necessary to remember and not do the things that led to the injustice that resulted in their exile. Far from not remembering the former things, I would assert that what God was really seeking and what Isaiah was asserting was not that God's people should forget, but that they must set aside or put behind the former things so that justice could reign supreme. Viewed this way, doing the work of justice is the theme that runs throughout this text from Isaiah. The world that this society had known would pass as God performed the work of transformation, the new heavens and the new earth. And transformation would be an ongoing process. We know from the beginning that God never intended creation to be a once and done thing. Genesis tells us that God put Adam and Eve in the garden to till and to tend. God's people were tasked with preserving and building upon God's work. Caring for this transformed world is the way that justice would come about and how it would continue to bring joy, hope, and abundant life to all of God's creation. Of course, we haven't witnessed the physical collapse of our society like the Jews in ancient Israel, but we have certainly observed the escalating breakdown of social norms. We hear many of our neighbors express the feeling that they're going backwards. What they earn doesn't keep up with what it costs to live in our communities. There are destructive actors in our society seeking to pit neighbor against neighbor, engaging in the blame game I spoke of earlier, provoking fear and often physical danger to those who are blamed and painted as targets. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that the situation in Jerusalem prior to the exile was similar to our present experience, and a similar disintegration in relationships and social norms is what led to Jerusalem's destruction. Lack of faithfulness to God, failure to observe God's call to justice and love, and denial or disregard of responsibility to neighbor and to all of creation has consequences. Knowing what we know from witnesses like Isaiah and Luke, we've not just the opportunity, but the responsibility to do better. Time and again through the ages, communities have allowed themselves to fall prey to false prophets, promising easy solutions and undeserved rewards. They've permitted injustices that result in poverty, hunger, suffering, violence, death, and the destruction of God's creation. Rather than looking to the promise of God to be faithful, the focus turns inward because circumstances instill fearfulness and anxiety. This focus on our personal well-being, rather than on God and neighbor, works to the detriment of others and our society as a whole. The good news in our text today is that God is always in the mix, even if we forget, and despite whatever we do to mess things up. No matter how bad things look for us, and as bad as things looked for the early Christian community and for a Jewish community in exile, we know we can trust God to be faithful. God promises a new creation. Things may look bleak, but as Paul declares, we know that all things work for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. God's purpose is justice and abundant life, and that is God's call to us. We are reminded that the journey for Christians is long, but God is always faithful. Therefore, we must be faithful as well. True justice won't happen without our faithfulness to God and to God's purpose. So we know we have a big job on our hands. We are encouraged to take that job on because God promises a new heaven and a new earth, suggesting that creation is an ongoing process. Calamity and death are not the final words. In these trying times, I encourage you to remember Isaiah's earlier words from God. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. We are not alone. Let us watch diligently for where God is working in our lives and in our world, for God is indeed working among us. And let us be prepared to assist in God's work to be co-creators in the new creation that is to come. Amen.